Cops shoot. Black man's dog, not knowing he's a deadly Delta Force Vetera. At first glance, he was just another black man walking his dog through a quiet southern neighborhood. Harmless, invisible. But when two arrogant cops pulled the trigger, they unleashed a nightmare they couldn't imagine. Because the man they thought they could intimidate was not just a man. He was a ghost, a weapon, a Delta Force legend with nothing left to lose. What follows isn't just a story of cruelty. It's a brutal lesson about who you choose to pick a fight with and what happens when you push the wrong person too far. Stay with us. You won't breathe the same after hearing this. They killed his dog thinking he was just another black man they could intimidate. But what they didn't know was that he was the deadliest Delta Force commander alive. What started as a simple act of cruelty would unleash a storm they could never outrun. Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you breathless. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. In the sun-drenched streets of Eleanor Whitmore, Georgia, where the Spanish moss dangled heavy from the ancient oak trees, and the air pulsed with the slow hum of the South, a man walked every evening with a German shepherd by his side. To most, Malcolm Rains was just another quiet resident, the kind who nodded politely but kept his distance. Yet if the people around him had known who he truly was, they might have clutched their children closer, crossed the street faster, or perhaps they might have looked at him with awe instead of suspicion. Malcolm Rains had spent over 2 decades in the shadowed heart of America's most lethal military operations. A Delta Force commander, a ghost in the records, a legend in whispered stories among soldiers who believed themselves too hardened to believe in legends. His name wasn't etched on medals. It was carved in the silence of missions that never officially happened. Entire regimes had toppled with the movements of his hands. Entire wars had shifted with his choices. He was the kind of man history books conveniently forgot. But the enemies of the United States would never, ever erase from memory. And yet here he was in Eleanor Whitmore, seeking nothing more than peace. Titan, his dog, was the only one who knew the full weight Malcolm Rains carried. The only one who knew the dreams that sometimes made him bolt upright at night, breathing like a man still running for his life. Titan, with his keen, wise eyes, had been more than a companion. He had been a brother in arms, in Iraq, Afghanistan. Even deep in the jungles of places the government denied operations had ever taken place, Titan had stood by him, silent and deadly, a force of nature trained to protect, to save, to endure. Theirs was a bond built not of words, but of life, shared in its rawest form. Blood, dust, gunpowder rain, loyalty that could never be questioned. And that was why, when the 2 police officers first spotted Malcolm Rains walking through the neighborhood leash in hand, they didn't see a war hero. They didn't see a man who had bled for a country that now watched him with weary, sidelong glances. They only saw a black man with a big dog in a neighborhood they didn't think he belonged to. Shane Merrick and Officer Kyle Proctor had made careers out of looking for problems where there were none. They operated under the easy arrogance that their badges were shields against consequence. Every sneer, every false charge, every accidental escalation was swallowed by a system eager to believe men like them and to doubt men like Malcolm Rains. That first night, when they rolled their cruisers slowly past Malcolm Rains and Titan, their windows down just enough to make their presence known, Malcolm Rains felt the old instincts prickling to life. The way you do when you're behind enemy lines and you know you're being watched. His fingers tightened slightly around Titan's leash. The command silent but understood. Be ready. Titan's ears flicked, his body straightened, but he didn't growl. Not yet. He trusted Malcolm Rains' stillness, The officer said nothing that night, just a long, slow, evaluating look followed by the rumble of the cruiser as it crept away, a threat left unspoken. Malcolm Raines didn't react. Reaction was how they won. Reaction was what they craved. But something inside him shifted that night. A seed of warning planted deep in his chest. These weren't men who would leave well enough alone. They were men who would need to be taught a lesson. Men who would push and push until they pushed too far. And Malcolm Raines knew better than anyone that the world often reserved its cruelest tests for those who asked for nothing but peace. The next morning he noticed it. The neighbors' glances growing colder. The slight hesitation in the barista's smile when she handed him his coffee, the unmarked patrol car idling half a block away as he walked Titan past the old courthouse. The message was clear. You are not welcome here. Malcolm Raines could have packed up and left. God knows he'd outrun worse, but that was never who he was. He had fought for every inch of ground he stood on, fought for the right to exist, to breathe free. And he wasn't about to surrender because two small men in uniforms felt threatened by a man they couldn't bully with a badge. Still, he prepared. It was in his nature. He adjusted his route, varying his walking times. He taught Titan subtle new commands, new alerts. He scoped out the exits of the neighborhood, memorized license plates, mapped the patrol patterns. Because if there was one thing Delta had taught him, it was that when war comes to your doorstep, you don't hope it passes by. You meet it and you end it. In Eleanor Whitmore, beneath the heavy watching trees and the slow churn of the river, a fuse had been lit. No one else knew it yet, but soon everyone would because they had chosen the wrong man. And because before this was over, Malcolm Raines was going to remind the world exactly what kind of man they had provoked. The ghost of Delta Force wasn't dead. He was just getting started. The air was thick with the kind of late summer heat that made everything feel heavy, even the simplest movements. Malcolm Raines adjusted the leash in his hand as Titan trotted faithfully by his side, the dog's body loose but his eyes sharp. It was supposed to be another ordinary evening walk through the winding streets of Eleanor Whitmore, another small effort to claim a piece of peace in a world that so often denied it to men like him. But something was different that day. Malcolm Raines could feel it humming in the atmosphere, the same way he had sensed ambushes 1,000 times before, the small tremors in the stillness, the way birds stopped singing, the way silence wasn't just quiet. It was wrong. He saw the cruiser first, a glint of light reflecting off the windshield as it rounded the corner. Too slow, too deliberate. Shane Merrick at the wheel, Officer Denton beside him, their faces etched with the smug assurance of men who believed they were untouchable. They pulled to the curb without a siren, without flashing lights, just a silent, inevitable wall cutting Malcolm Raines off from the sidewalk ahead. Titan shifted slightly, pressing his body closer to Malcolm Raines's leg. Sensing the threat, Malcolm Raines didn't need to give a command. Titan already knew. Colton stepped out first, casually adjusting his belt, letting his hand linger just a little too long near his holster. Denton followed, a grin already pulling at the corner of his mouth like he was stepping onto a stage he had rehearsed for. "Evening," Colton said, voice thick with condescension. Malcolm Raines nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Evening, officers." "You live around here?" Denton asked, his tone light, almost playful. But Malcolm Raines knew better, knew exactly how they were setting the trap. "I do," Malcolm Raines answered, pulling his ID from his back pocket before they could even ask. A preemptive move designed to leave them no excuse. "House on Waverly Lane. You can check if you'd like." Colton took the ID without looking at it, tucking it into his vest. It wasn't about the ID. It had never been. "Funny," Denton said, tilting his head. "We've had a few calls about a suspicious individual. Someone matching your description. Big dog prowling around." Malcolm Raines let the accusation hang there. Didn't rise to it. Didn't feed the fire they were desperate to light. "Walking my dog isn't prowling," he said calmly. But calm didn't matter. Logic didn't matter. Colton smirked, stepping closer. Mind if we pat you down? Just a precaution. Malcolm Raines stiffened almost imperceptibly. Not fear, never fear, calculation. He knew his rights. He could refuse, but refusal would be painted later as aggression, as non-compliance. Before he could respond, Denton moved fast, clumsy, reckless. A hand grabbed at Malcolm Raines' arm, pulling, shoving, forcing. Titan barked, a single sharp sound muscle memory igniting. The leash in Malcolm Raines' hand went taut, and then everything shattered. The gun came out almost lazily, like it had been waiting all along. Denton's hand moved, and before Malcolm Raines could form the word no, before he could give Titan the command to retreat, to fall back, the shot cracked through the heavy air. Titan jerked a horrible, instinctive spasm that Malcolm Raines would remember in frozen frames for the rest of his life. The leaf slackened. The weight at the end of it crumpled to the ground with a sickening finality. For a moment, the world paused, soundless, motionless. Malcolm Raines dropped to his knees, hands flying to Titan, to the thick fur now slick and hot with blood, to the glassy, confused eyes still locked on him. Titan whimpered once, a high, broken sound Malcolm Raines had never heard from him before, and then he stilled, gone. Malcolm Raines didn't hear what the officers were saying after that, didn't register the orders barked above him. All he could hear was the blood rushing in his ears. All he could feel was the rage rising inside him like a force he could not contain. A violence older and more sacred than any war he had ever fought. Colton's hand was on him again, dragging him up, wrenching his arm behind his back. He let it happen. Let them press him against the hood of the cruiser. Let the cuffs bite into his wrists. His body obeyed because his mind had already slipped into another place entirely. A place where time stretched thin and every movement, every breath was a choice between survival and annihilation. He could have ended them right there. Could have turned and dismantled them with the kind of precision violence only a handful of men on Earth were capable of. It would have been easy. It would have been justified. But he didn't, because Malcolm Raines wasn't just a soldier. He was a weapon, and weapons didn't waste themselves on moments of rage. They waited. They chose their moment. They made sure that when they struck, there would be no doubt, no cover story, no redemption. The officers shoved him into the back seat, laughing like they had already won, like he was just another nameless, faceless man they could erase without consequence. They didn't understand. They didn't even realize. They hadn't just killed his dog. They had declared war on a man who had been born to win wars. And as the cruiser pulled away from the curb, leaving Titan's lifeless body cooling on the sun-warmed pavement, Malcolm Raines closed his eyes for just a moment, long enough to make a promise. He wasn't going to fight them in the streets. He wasn't going to fight them with fists or guns or even fear. He was going to destroy them completely, systematically, ruthlessly, because some wars aren't fought in foreign lands. Some wars are personal, and this one had just begun. The cell smelled of sweat bleach and old rage. Malcolm Raines Brookie sat alone, the fluorescent light buzzing above his head like a relentless wasp, a constant irritation that refused to be ignored. His wrists throbbed where the cuffs had bitten into his skin earlier, his shirt still stained from Titan's blood. Every breath he drew felt thick with betrayal. They had booked him without a charge. A tactic as old as injustice itself. Lock a man away long enough and hope he forgets he deserves to be free. Malcolm Raines didn't forget. He couldn't. Not with Titan's death etched behind his eyelids every time he blinked. Not with the echo of that gunshot carved into the marrow of his bones. Hours blurred into a timeless, grinding haze. He replayed everything, every step he had taken that day. Every measured word he had spoken, every chance he had given them to make a different choice. It hadn't mattered. It was never meant to matter. To Colton and Denton, he had never been Malcolm Raines' decorated Delta Force commander, defender of lives in places most Americans had never even heard of. To them, he had been just another black man walking a dog too big, standing too tall, breathing too free. He wasn't angry anymore. No anger was a wildfire, destructive but short-lived. What he felt now was colder, deeper. It was a forging. The same transformation that had carried him through the killing fields of Kandahar, the jungles of Colombia, the deserts of Mali. It was a return not to violence for violence's sake, but to something purer, purpose. When the guard finally came to release him, Malcolm Rains stood without a word. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had decided he would never be caught off guard again. His fingers brushed against the edge of the intake counter as he retrieved his personal items. Wallet, phone, keys, a leash still sticky with blood folded neatly in a plastic evidence bag. He took it all without flinching. Outside, the night had broken open into a bruised purple sky. The air heavy with a scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. He walked through it each step, grounding him deeper into the reality of what had been done and what must be done next. At home, the house was too quiet. The leash he placed reverently on the kitchen table, a monument to a loyalty that had deserved better. The stillness was oppressive, every shadow another reminder of the absence Titan had left behind. Malcolm Rains poured a glass of water but didn't drink it. Instead, he stood at the window, staring out at the darkness until his own reflection faded into it. He wasn't thinking about revenge. Revenge was petty impulsive. It could be bought off with a few apologies, a headline no one remembered by next week. What he was preparing for was something else entirely. Retribution. It would be clean, precise, unstoppable. He opened the locked trunk at the back of his closet, the one he had sworn never to touch again when he left the service. Inside, everything was still where he had left it. The files, the surveillance equipment, the gear designed for infiltration, for understanding an enemy so completely that escape became impossible. Colton and Denton weren't just enemies now. They were targets. But Malcolm Rains wasn't just targeting them. No, that would be too easy. What they represented had to be gutted root and stem. He needed to understand who had enabled them, who had covered for them, who had whispered in back rooms that these men were fine officers just doing their jobs. He needed to bring down not just the men who pulled the trigger, but the entire system that had loaded the gun for them. He began that night methodically, without anger, without hesitation. The research started with property records, disciplinary histories, internal memos leaked in dark corners of the web, every reprimand that had been quietly sealed, every complaint brushed aside, every lawyer paid to keep mouth shut. He found them all. Eleanor Whitmore's corruption was not a matter of speculation. It was written plainly in the fingerprints of bureaucracy, hiding in plain sight because the world had stopped looking. He built the board on his living room wall, stringing together connections like a spider weaving a web. Officers, judges, city council members, a DA who had quietly declined to press charges against police misconduct cases 73% of the time. Every string led somewhere. Every face was another brick in the wall they had tried to crush him against. By dawn, the first layer was complete. Malcolm Rains stood back studying it not as a soldier, but as a tactician. Every target had a weakness. Every lie had a seam waiting to be pulled apart. It wasn't enough to expose them. They had to destroy each other, turn their own weapons inward. This war wasn't going to be fought with guns. It was going to be fought with truth, weaponized, amplified, unavoidable. And he wasn't going to stop until Eleanor Whitmore itself was forced to confront the blood on its hands. Malcolm Rains sat down at the kitchen table, Titan's leash beside him, and began drafting the first emails, carefully worded, designed not to accuse, but to plant seeds of doubt, suspicion, fear designed to make those who had hidden behind badges and titles and good old boy networks start to wonder who knew who was watching, who would be next. They thought they had broken him, but all they had done was awaken the warrior who had been sleeping beneath his skin, waiting for a cause worthy enough to make him rise again. They had made the fatal mistake of thinking Malcolm Rains was just a man. But he wasn't. He was every battle they thought they had won. He was every reckoning they thought would never come. and he was just getting started. The first tremors were almost invisible. A leaked document here. A tip dropped into an anonymous inbox there. Eleanor Whitmore's foundation, built on whispered favors and unspoken threats, began to crack in places its architects had long forgotten to reinforce. Malcolm Raines didn't launch an attack with fanfare. He made the system collapse on itself. The first to feel it was Marcus Voss, a man who had sat on internal affairs boards for years, burying complaints before they reached daylight. An email forwarded from a burner account contained copies of sealed testimonies timelines that didn't match official records lists of victims who had never been given their day in court. The damning part wasn't what Hawthorne had done. It was the fact that now it could be proven beyond doubt. 2 days later, a reporter at the Eleanor Whitmore Chronicle received a flash drive by courier. No return address, no fingerprints. The files inside showed edited body cam footage, internal memos contradicting public statements, confidential settlements that painted a damning portrait of a city more concerned with protecting its officers than its people. The headlines exploded. City officials scrambled to control the narrative, but Malcolm Raines was always one step ahead. He knew their playbook better than they did because he had spent years in war zones dismantling networks far more disciplined and dangerous than a corrupt police force and a few crooked politicians. Each move he made wasn't random. It was calculated precise, a series of dominoes falling in inevitable succession. As panic spread through the higher ranks, alliances fractured. Hawthorne turned on Samuel Kincaid. Maddox pointed fingers at the mayor's office. Old betrayals resurfaced. Accusations sharpened, and the whole rotten structure Malcolm Raines had targeted began to collapse under the weight of its own cowardice. Yet even as chaos roiled the city's power centers, Malcolm Raines remained invisible, a ghost pulling strings no one could trace back to him. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. It was about justice reasserting itself, like a tide returning to claim what had been stolen. Meanwhile, Shane Merrick and Kyle Proctor, once strutting symbols of authority, found themselves exposed, abandoned by the very system they had believed would shield them forever. Their faces flooded the news cycles. Their names smeared across social media in threads of outrage and sorrow and fury. At first, they tried to fight back. They hired lawyers, filed countersuits, painted themselves as victims of a coordinated smear campaign. But no amount of rhetoric could erase the footage, the testimonies, the mountain of evidence Malcolm Raines had so meticulously unearthed. People remembered the video of Titan crumpling to the pavement. They remembered Malcolm Raines' calm voice as he begged for his dog's life. They remembered the look in his eyes when he was dragged away in cuffs, silent but unbroken. The public didn't just want apologies anymore. They wanted accountability. And this time they weren't letting go. In the background, Malcolm Raines kept pushing. Anonymous tips steered federal investigators to irregularities in procurement contracts, unregistered off-the-books activities, hidden financial accounts linked to key officers. Every stone they turned revealed another nest of rot, and the Department of Justice, once reluctant to wade into Eleanor Whitmore's affairs, had no choice but to intervene. Indictments followed not just against Briggs and Denton, but against several high-ranking officials who had enabled them. Men who thought they were insulated by decades of business as usual found themselves cuffed, their mugshot plastered across the same news outlets that once printed their campaign ads. Malcolm Raines watched it unfold from the sidelines, quiet, relentless. This wasn't the quick, fiery justice so many dreamed of. It was a slow, methodical dismantling exactly as he intended, but victories, even righteous ones, come at a cost. Late one evening, as the news broadcast yet another arrest tied to the scandal, Malcolm Raines sat in his darkened living room and felt a weight pressing against his chest. He had won battles most men couldn't even comprehend, yet the chair opposite him remained empty. No thudding paws across the hardwood, no quiet, reassuring sighs from a loyal companion sprawled at his feet. The house was still haunted, not by guilt. He knew he had done what had to be done, but by absence. Retribution, no matter how thorough, could not bring Titan back. And Malcolm Raines knew deep down that true peace would never really come. Not in this life. Still, there was work left to do. He couldn't afford the luxury of mourning yet. The people who had lost sons, brothers, fathers to the unchecked brutality of Eleanor Whitmore's corrupted guardians. They deserved to see this through. They deserved a world where their children could walk freely, safely, joyfully, without fear curdling in their bellies at the sight of a patrol car. This wasn't about one man's grief anymore. It was about making sure no one else's story ended the way Titan's had. Malcolm Raines picked up the worn collar from the table, his fingers running lightly over the faded stitching. "You started this fight," he said quietly into the empty room, "and I'm going to finish it." Outside, the city trembled on the edge of transformation. Inside, Malcolm Raines, the most lethal warrior Eleanor Whitmore never saw coming, was already planning his next move. The tide had turned, and it wasn't done rising. The day the verdicts were announced, Eleanor Whitmore stood still. In a packed federal courtroom, the final chapter of a saga built on arrogance and cruelty came crashing down. Malcolm Raines sat in the back row, composed but unflinching, as the jury delivered the words he had been waiting to hear for so long. Guilty on all counts. Shane Merrick and Kyle Proctor, stripped of their uniforms and their illusions, stared straight ahead as the weight of their crimes finally bore down on them. 25 years, each no possibility of parole. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was balance long overdue. When the gavel fell for the last time, Malcolm Raines didn't move. He let the noise wash over him, the murmurs, the sighs, the barely stifled tears of families who had waited too long for justice. It wasn't just his victory. It was for every man, woman, and child who had lived under the shadow of fear, branded as threats for the color of their skin, for the neighborhoods they called home, for the lives they dared to live freely. Outside, the sun was high golden against the crumbling bricks of the courthouse. Protesters and supporters filled the streets not with anger this time, but with a cautious kind of hope. Signs read, "Justice served and never again." For the first time, it felt like the city had chosen to look at its reflection honestly and didn't turn away. Malcolm Raines slipped through the crowd unnoticed, just another man among many. That was how he wanted it. This had never been about fame or recognition. It had been about one thing. From the first moment Titan collapsed into his arms to the long, sleepless nights, plotting the downfall of those who believed themselves untouchable. Loyalty not just to a memory, but to a principle. He walked toward Forsyth Park, the heart of Eleanor Whitmore, where oak trees stretched their arms overhead and the Spanish moss whispered stories of generations past. The park was almost empty in the midday heat. Malcolm Raines found a quiet bench near the fountain, sat down, and closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the city drift past him. For the first time in months, there was no plan running through his mind, no next step to take, no invisible war to fight. The silence was unfamiliar, unsettling even. The war was over, but the scars would never leave him. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside was Titan's badge, the one the local trainer had given them after they passed their advanced protection certification, a nod to Max's discipline, intelligence, and heart. Malcolm Raines turned it over in his palm, feeling the worn edges against his skin. Titan had been more than a dog. He had been a partner, a guardian, a piece of Malcolm Raines' own soul stitched into flesh and fur. "You did good, boy," Malcolm Raines whispered, his voice rough at the edges. "We did good." The world would never know the full story. They would see the headlines, the evening news, sound bites, the sanitized versions of what had happened. But that was enough. The truth had bled into the open. It would stain everything it touched. Eleanor Whitmore would heal in time. And maybe, just maybe, other cities would look at what happened here and learn. There were already calls for reform demands to rebuild the police force from the ground up, to institute community-led review boards, to end the decades of unchecked brutality that had festered in the dark. Malcolm Raines didn't fool himself into thinking it would be easy. The roots ran deep. Some would resist. Some would cling to the old ways, fighting the tide he and Titan had unleashed. But change had begun. Real change. And if he had to vanish into the background to let it happen, he would. He hadn't fought for his name to be remembered. He had fought so that Titan's death would mean something, so that no one else would have to watch their best friend die in their arms because someone with a badge decided they were disposable. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, Malcolm Raines rose from the bench. He slipped the badge back into his pocket, tucked the memories close where they would always stay. His path forward was unclear, but he was no stranger to uncertainty. He had lived in shadows before. This time he would live in the light Titan had given him, even if it burned sometimes. He took one last look at the fountain, the park, the city that had broken and rebuilt him all at once. Then he turned and walked away, not with the slow, burdened steps of a man carrying grief, but with the steady, unyielding stride of a soldier who had fought the war and won. Justice wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it had been served. And for Malcolm Raines, that was enough to move forward. In the story of Malcolm Raines, we witnessed a man who lived quietly, honorably, never asking for recognition, despite having risked his life countless times for his country. It was not until the world he trusted turned on him, until his loyal companion Titan was brutally taken away, that Malcolm Raines was forced to awaken the part of himself he had long tried to bury. The warrior, the protector, the force of justice that did not ask for permission. Through relentless betrayal, heartbreak, and pain, Malcolm Raines found the strength to rise. But he did not choose the path of chaos or blind vengeance. He chose precision, patience, and wisdom. He built his case piece by piece, not for personal glory, but for the countless voiceless people who had suffered under the same cruel, broken system. His story was not about revenge. It was about restoring balance, about making sure that those who inflicted suffering would finally feel its weight. Malcolm Raines didn't fight for himself. He fought for principle, for loyalty to those he loved, for the idea that justice should not belong only to the powerful, but to every person who dares to live freely. And in the end, despite the temptation to destroy everything with rage, he held true to his values and won a victory that reached far beyond his own life. The lesson from Malcolm Raines' journey is profound. In the face of injustice, anger is easy, but discipline, resilience, and unwavering loyalty to truth are what change the world. He reminds us that there are battles worth fighting not with reckless violence, but with strategic, unstoppable force guided by a moral compass that never wavers. Real strength is not measured by how hard you can hit back, but by how patiently and powerfully you can build something that can never be broken again. In our own lives, we will face moments when injustice touches us personally, times when it feels easier to give up or worse to lash out blindly. Malcolm Raines. The story teaches us that the greatest victories are those earned through disciplined strategy and an unshakable sense of purpose. We don't have to be soldiers or operatives to live this way. We just have to be willing to stand up when it matters most, to speak when silence would be easier, to protect what we know is right, even if no one is watching. In the end, true change happens not in grand explosive gestures, but in the determined steady steps of those who refuse to let injustice stand unchallenged. If Malcolm Raines could rise from his loss to change his city forever, imagine what each of us could do in our own lives, in our own communities, if we chose to carry that same fire forward. Thank you for staying with this powerful story until the very end. If you found value, inspiration, or even just a spark of strength in Malcolm Raines' journey, please subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the motivation to continue sharing more real, raw, and moving stories that leave a lasting mark. Let's keep building a community where truth, justice, and loyalty are never forgotten. Stay strong, stay true, and we'll see you in the next story. Malcolm Raines never asked for a fight. All he wanted was a quiet life, a peaceful walk with Titan by his side. But when corruption wears a badge, when ego hides behind a gun, peace becomes a battlefield. The day Shane Merrick and Kyle Proctor pulled their stunt, they didn't just kill a dog, they lit a fuse under a man the world should have left alone. And Malcolm didn't respond with chaos. He responded with precision. He didn't burn Savannah down. He forced Savannah to confront its own rot, from Marcus Voss, burying complaints, to Samuel Kincaid, pulling the strings, to Eleanor Whitmore, smiling for cameras while shielding it all. Malcolm Raines proved that real power doesn't come from noise. It comes from discipline, from unrelenting truth. But now the question turns to you. Was Malcolm right to take justice into his own hands when the system failed him, or should even the worst corruption be left to proper channels? Comment below. Be honest. Would you have stayed quiet? And if this story struck a chord, if you believe loyalty deserves more than a bullet and dignity demands more than apologies, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Soulful Stories Fa. Here we tell the stories that matter. The stories they hope you'll forget. Because sometimes it takes a man like Malcolm Raines and a sacrifice like Titan's to remind the world that justice isn't given. It's earned, one fight at a time.